The great hall at Ravensmere held 100 candles that night, and not one of them was lit for her. Honoria Vane stood in the doorway, in a gray wool gown 3 winters out of fashion, and watched the footman lay the table for the wedding eve dinner. She had been told to come down. She had not been told why, and so she waited, with her soft hands folded and her straight back betraying nothing, while the under-butler walked the length of the long table, setting down the silver, and stopped, with deliberate care, to place the great Chase salt cellar exactly 2/3 of the way along the white cloth. Above the salt sat the Duke's chair, and the chairs of his guests, and the carved seat that would soon belong to the woman he meant to make his duchess. Below the salt, where the cloth grew plainer, and the candlelight thinned to shadow, sat one place laid with a chipped horn-handled spoon and a wooden trencher, the kind a steward might give a tenant's child. The under-butler did not look at Honoria when he said it. He did not need to. Everyone in the house knew whose place it was. She let them believe it. She let them believe she was nothing, a poor relation, a charity ward, a girl who ate where the salt no longer reached. She let them seat her below the silver and call it kindness that she was fed at all. She let them, because they did not yet know whose name was written on the deed to the ground their proud house stood upon. And neither, that night, did the Duke. Adrian, Duke of Ravensmere, came down the staircase at 8 o'clock, with a candle in his hand, and a coldness in his face that the candle could not warm. He was a tall man, dark-haired, 38, with a kind of austere handsomeness that made strangers lower their voices. He had held the title 11 months. He wore it the way other men wore mourning, heavily, and as if it did not quite fit. His father, the old Duke, had died in the spring with his accounts in ruin and his secrets unconfessed, and Adrian had come home from the continent to find a great estate that everyone called his, and a pile of papers that, read closely, did not entirely agree. He saw the gray gown in the doorway and did not know the woman in it. He had seen her perhaps 4 times since his return. He had asked her name once, in March, and forgotten it by April. He took her now for some upper servant Mrs. Quill had failed to keep below stairs. "You," he said, not unkindly, only absently, the way a man speaks to furniture that is in his way. "The candles in the long gallery have not been trimmed. See to it before the guests come up." Honoria looked at him for the length of one breath. She might have told him then. She had the means in a Japan tin box upstairs, beneath a loose board under her cot, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. A document with a great red seal, and a signature that would have stopped the breath in his throat. She might have spoken 3 sentences, and overturned the table he stood beside. She did not. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, and went to trim the candles, because she had decided, 11 months ago, that she would not say a single word until the day she could say all of them at once. This is the story of that day, and of the long candlelit road that led to it. It is the story of a wife who sat below the salt at her own table, and held all the while the deed to her husband's estate. To understand it, you must go back further than that dinner, further than the old Duke's death, back to a small stone church on the Ravensmere lands on a wet morning 24 years before, when a different Duke knelt at a different altar and married a woman the world was never meant to know. He loved. Her name was Margaret Aldous. She was the daughter of a country attorney, well born enough to be a lady, not nearly grand enough to be a duchess. The old Duke, then a young man burning under the weight of his own coronet, married her in secret because his father would never have allowed it, and his father held the purse. They were wed by a frightened curate with 2 grooms for witnesses, and the marriage was real, and registered, and witnessed, and binding under the law of the land. And then it was hidden, folded away like a letter a man cannot bear to burn, and dare not let be read. Margaret brought to that secret marriage one thing of value, a tract of land. Her grandfather, a shrewd old wool merchant, had bought the freehold of the home farm and the very ground at the foot of Ravensmere Hill 2 generations before, when an earlier duke had been desperate for ready money. It had been settled upon Margaret at her marriage, settled tightly, in trust, in a marriage settlement drawn by her attorney father, who did not trust dukes and said so. The settlement gave the land to Margaret, and after her, to the lawful children of her body, not to the duke, not to the title, to her line. The great house of Ravensmere, its terraces, its long gallery, its stables and its rose garden, and the very flagstones of the great hall, sat upon that ground. The duke owned the title, and the timber and the deer park beyond the wall. But the heart of the estate, the ground the house was built on, belonged to Margaret Aldous and her heirs, and the proof of it lay in a deed and a settlement, sealed with red wax and signed by a duke's own hand. Margaret bore 1 child, a daughter, and died of a fever before that daughter could walk. The old duke, half mad with grief and wholly a coward, did the cruelest thing a frightened man can do. He hid the child as he had hidden the wife. He gave the baby out to be raised by the attorney's sister, a Mrs. Vane, under the Vane name, as a poor cousin's orphan. He paid a small sum for her keeping and told himself he would set it right. He buried the marriage register entry under a false leaf in the parish book. He locked the settlement and the deed in a box, and the box in a desk, and the desk in a memory he tried never to open. And in time, he married again, openly, properly, a great heiress this time, and had a son, Adrian, and let the world believe his line had begun with that second wife. The daughter he hid was Honoria. She did not know it for most of her life. She knew only that she was poor and a Vane, and that twice a year a steward from Ravensmere brought money for her board and never met her eyes. When Mrs. Vane died, the money stopped, and a man named Mr. Barlow, a guardian appointed by a will Honoria never saw, took charge of her, and the charge he took was to make her useful and keep her quiet. He placed her at Ravensmere itself as a companion to nobody in particular, a girl to fetch and carry and be grateful. He did it, though Honoria did not know this either, because Barlow had found the false leaf in the parish register and the settlement in the old duke's desk, and had understood at once what a dangerous and valuable thing he held, and had decided that a Honoria kept ignorant and dependent was worth more to him than a Honoria who knew her own name. So she came to live in the house her own mother had owned the ground beneath, and to eat below the salt, and to be told to trim the candles by a man who was, though neither of them knew it, her half-brother's heir, to a title that could not stand without her land. That is what no one at the wedding eve dinner knew. That is the powder beneath the floor of this story. Now light the candles, and let us see how it caught. The guests came up from the gallery at 8:30, and the dinner began. There were 16 at table, all above the salt. There was Lady Pruitt, the old duke's widow's cousin, a sharp gray woman who had run the house in the months of mourning, and meant to keep running it through whatever wife the new duke chose. There was the Honorable Mr. Crail, who laughed too loudly. Among them sat a bishop, and the bishop's silent wife, and 3 daughters of 3 baronets, who had each been brought in the hope of catching the duke's eye before it was too late. For the duke's eye, everyone now understood, had already been caught. It had been caught by Mrs. Sefton. She sat at the duke's right hand in claret-colored silk, a handsome widow of 29, with a wide white throat and a way of laughing that began before anything funny had been said. She was not yet the Duchess. The banns had not been read, but she wore the late Duchess's pearls. Adrian had given them to her at Easter, and she had already chosen the room she would take, and she spoke to the servants in the voice of a mistress. And when she looked down the table at the gray girl below the salt, she looked at her the way one looks at a stain one intends to have removed. "Your Grace keeps a charity," Mrs. Sefton said to the Duke, in a voice pitched to carry, her eyes on Honoria. How very good of you, though I confess I cannot always tell your charities from your chambermaids." A ripple of laughter ran along the table above the salt. Lady Pruitt did not laugh, but she smiled, which was worse. The bishop studied his soup. Adrian looked down the table. For a moment, only a moment, his cold gaze rested on the gray gown, the straight back, the soft hands folded beside the wooden trencher. Something in the steadiness of her stillness snagged at him, the way a thread snags on a rough nail. She did not flinch. She did not redden. She met his eyes with a composure that no chambermaid he had ever met possessed. And then she lowered them. Not in shame, he thought, but as a queen lowers her eyes to dismiss a tedious court. "She is a connection of the house," he said. He did not know why he said it. It was nearly a defense, and he had not meant to make one. "Mrs. Sefton, the partridge is at your elbow." But Mrs. Sefton was not to be turned. "A connection," she repeated, savoring it. What a charitable word. And does the connection have a name? Or do we call her after the room she sleeps in? "Honoria Vane," said Honoria, from below the salt, before anyone could answer for her. Her voice was low and clear, and carried farther than Mrs. Sefton's had, because it did not strain. "And I have dined in this hall longer than you have, madam. I was here when the candles were lit for the old Duke's last Christmas. I shall likely be here when they are lit for things you do not yet imagine." The hall went very quiet. A log shifted in the great fireplace. Lady Pruitt's smile thinned to a line. "How impertinent," Mrs. Sefton said, but the laugh that began in her throat did not arrive. Adrian looked at the gray girl a second time, and this time the snag went deeper. "I shall likely be here when they are lit for things you do not yet imagine." It was not the speech of a servant. It was not even the speech of a poor relation. It was a sentence with a floor under it, spoken by someone standing on ground she was sure of. "Eat your dinner, Miss Vane," he said, but he said it quietly, and for the rest of the meal his eyes returned to her below the salt more often than he meant them to, and each time she was sitting exactly as a duchess sits, only in gray, and below the silver, and with a wooden spoon. When the cloth was drawn and the ladies withdrew, Lady Pruitt caught Honoria by the wrist in the cold passage outside the drawing-room and pressed her sharp nails into the soft skin there. "You will not speak again," she said. "Not at his table, not before his bride. You are here on sufferance, girl. Mr. Barlow placed you here, and Mr. Barlow can place you in the parish workhouse with one letter, and well, you know it. Whatever heirs your dead aunt gave you, they end at that door. Do you understand me?" Honoria looked down at the hand on her wrist, and then up at the older woman's face. "I understand you perfectly, Lady Pruitt," she said. "I have understood you for a very long time. That is rather the trouble with people who think me a fool. I have had a great deal of quiet in which to understand them." She drew her wrist free, gently, and went up the back stairs to her cold room under the eaves, and there, by the light of one tallow candle, she took the loose board up from the floor and lifted out the japanned tin box, and opened it, and looked, as she did most nights, at the great red seal and the signature beneath it, and the brittle leaf of the parish register she had quietly removed from the church 3 months before, and copied in her own neat hand, and replaced, so that 2 copies now existed where the old Duke had thought there was none. She did not weep over them. She had stopped weeping years before. She traced the seal with one finger, the way another woman might trace a lover's name, and she said aloud to the empty room the thing she said every night, like a prayer she had written herself. "Not yet, but soon." Then she closed the box, and put it under the board, and blew out the candle, and lay in the dark, listening to the great house creak. The house her mother had owned the ground beneath, full of people who thought they owned her. The wedding did not happen. It was meant to happen at Michaelmas, but in the 2nd week of September, the Duke's man of business came down from London with a face like a closed door, and what he carried in his black leather case changed everything, though not, at first, in Honoria's favor. Mr. Hale was a thin, precise solicitor of perhaps 50, with spectacles he cleaned with a gray silk handkerchief whenever he was about to say something he had rather not. He had served the Ravensmere family for 29 years. He had served the old Duke and the old Duke's father, and he knew where a great many bodies were buried, though he did not yet know, that September, about the one buried under the false leaf in the parish register. What Mr. Hale knew was this: the estate was insolvent. Not embarrassed, not strained, insolvent. The old Duke had borrowed against the timber, and borrowed again against the deer park, and borrowed a third time against the home farm, and the very ground the house stood upon. And that third loan, the largest of all, had been called. "You cannot pay it, Your Grace," Mr. Hale said, in the cold library, cleaning his spectacles. "Not from income. The rents are spent 3 years forward. The bank will take the house unless the debt against the home farm and the house ground is discharged by Lady Day." He set his spectacles back on his nose and looked at the Duke. "And there is a complication with the house ground I do not yet understand. The title to it is not clean. Your father borrowed against it as if it were his to pledge. I am no longer certain that it was." Adrian stood at the window with his back to the room. Beyond the glass, the rose garden was going brown, and past it the home farm, and past that the long green ground at the foot of the hill that his father had pledged to a bank as if it were his own. "Explain," he said. "I cannot, yet," said Mr. Hale. "The deed your father lodged with the bank is a copy, and an old one, and it refers to a settlement I have never seen, a marriage settlement. I have written to the bank for the particulars. I would suggest, Your Grace, in the strongest terms, that the wedding be postponed until the estate's affairs are clear. A duke does not bring a bride to a house the bank may carry off. So, the wedding was postponed, and Mrs. Sefton was furious, and Lady Pruitt was furious, and the 3 baronets' daughters went home, and a cold and watchful winter settled over Ravensmere. And in the cold and the watchfulness, slowly, the Duke began to see the girl below the salt. He saw her first in the still room in October by accident. He had gone wandering through the lower house at midnight, unable to sleep for the figures in Mr. Hale's ledgers, and he had found a light burning and looked in, expecting a careless servant. He found Honoria at the long deal table, the household account books open before her, a candle at her elbow, checking the butcher's reckoning against the larder. "Mrs. Quill cannot do her sums by candlelight any longer," Honoria said without looking up when he stood too long in the doorway. "Her eyes are going. So I do them, and let her sign them, so that no one need know. The butcher has overcharged us 4 shillings and 3 on the September account. I am about to find where." Adrian came into the still room. He, the Duke, into the still room at midnight, and looked over her shoulder at the long columns of her neat figures, and saw at once that she kept books better than Mr. Hale's own clerks. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My aunt was an attorney's sister," Honoria said, turning a page. "She taught me that a woman who cannot read a column of figures will be cheated by everyone she meets, and that a woman who can will be feared by half of them, which is nearly as good as being loved, and a great deal more useful." She found her error in the butcher's column, and made a small, precise mark beside it. "There. 4 and 3. I will speak to him on Friday. You speak to the butcher." "Someone must, Your Grace, and Lady Pruitt believes that speaking to butchers is beneath her, and Mrs. Sefton believes that everything is beneath her, and so it falls to the connection of the house." She looked up at him then, and the candlelight caught the steadiness in her gray eyes. "Did you want something? It is very late for a duke to be below stairs." He had not wanted anything. He had wanted not to think about the bank, but he stayed, leaning against the cold dresser, and watched her finish the books, and for the first time in 11 months of being Duke, He did not feel the title sitting on him like wet wool. "You are not what you appear to be," he said at last, slowly, as a man says a thing he is only just discovering. A connection of the house does not keep its accounts at midnight and save its housekeeper's pride. Honoria closed the ledger. "No," she agreed. "I am not what I appear to be. Very few people are, Your Grace. The trick of it is to be patient and let them go on appearing until appearing has cost them something they cannot get back." She rose and gathered the books and curtsied to him, properly, but with that same faint queenliness that snagged at him every time. "Good night. The candle by the door is yours. Mine is nearly burned out, and I have learned to find my way in the dark." She left him standing in the still room with the guttering candle, and he did not sleep that night either, but for a different reason. Through November and December he found more reasons to be where she was. It shamed him a little, and he told himself it was only that the house was empty of company, and she was the only mind in it worth speaking to. He found her teaching the youngest scullery maid to read by the kitchen fire. He found her dressing a tenant child's burned arm with a calm that the doctor lacked. And then, on the 3rd night of December, the river rose. It had rained for 9 days without stopping, and on the 9th night the Ravensmere brook came over its banks in the dark and took the low cottages of the home farm. 3 of them, where the Hobb family and the Tranters lived, the oldest and poorest of the Duke's tenants, on the very ground at the foot of the hill. A boy came hammering at the kitchen door at 2 in the morning, soaked to the bone, crying that his grandfather would not leave the cottage, and the water was at the sill and rising. The house woke in confusion. Lady Pruitt, roused, said it was a matter for the steward, and the steward was abed in the village 2 miles off, and the road was under water. Mrs. Sefton did not wake at all. Honoria woke and dressed in the dark in under a minute, and was in the kitchen with her sleeves already turned back before the Duke came down in his shirt with a candle, not knowing what a man did in such a case, because no one had ever taught a Duke to do anything. "What is to be done?" he asked her. Her, the connection of the house in front of the frightened servants, and she heard in it, even then, the first real seating of his pride. "3 things, and quickly," Honoria said, pinning up her hair without a glass. "Daniel, rouse every man who can stand and bring lanterns in the long cart, and every dry blanket from the linen press. Lady Pruitt may scold me for the linen tomorrow, and I shall enjoy it. Mrs. Quill, build the kitchen fire up and set the great kettle on. We will have cold, wet people here within the hour, and they will need heat more than they need anything. Your Grace." She paused and looked at him, and made a decision that no companion below the salt had any business making. "Your Grace will come with me to the cottages, because old Mr. Hobb will not be carried out by a footman, but he might be persuaded out by his landlord, if his landlord asks him as a man, and not as a duke. Can you do that?" "I do not know," Adrian said, with a plain honesty that surprised them both. "I have never been asked to." "Then tonight you will learn," she said, and handed him a lantern, and went out into the rain. What the Duke saw that night he never afterward forgot, and it did more to win him than any ball could have done. He saw the gray girl wade thigh-deep into black freezing floodwater in the lantern light to reach the Tranter's door, and lift the Tranter baby out of its mother's arms and carry it high and dry to the cart with a steadiness that did not falter though her lips were blue. He saw her speak to terrified people by name, every name, the children's names, the names of their dead, so that the terror in them eased because someone knew them. And he saw her get old Mr. Hobb out at last, the stubborn old man who would not leave for any footman, because she crouched in the water at his hearth and said, "Mr. Hobb, your father farmed this ground, and his father before him, and I will not let the brook have a Hobb tonight. I have plans for this farm, and you are in them. Now give me your arm, and let us cheat the water together." And the old man, weeping, gave her his arm. The Duke beside her did as he was bid. He carried, and he lifted, and he stood thigh-deep in the cold, holding a lantern steady so that she could see. And once, When she stumbled on a sunk stone with the baby in her arms, it was his hand that caught her elbow and held her up. And for one heartbeat in the rain and the lantern light, they looked at each other, and something passed between them that neither named. By dawn, the three families were dry by Mrs. Quill's kitchen fire, with hot broth in them, and the linen press emptied over their shoulders, and not one soul was lost. And the home farm cottages stood ruined, but their people did not. Adrian stood in the steaming kitchen in his soaked shirt at first light, and watched her go from family to family. And he said, "Lo, only for her. You knew every one of their names. I am their duke, and I knew not one. You crouched in the water and told Hob you had plans for his farm. What plans, Miss Vane? On what authority does a companion of the house make plans for a duke's farm?" Honoria, wringing out her sodden hem, did not look up. "On the authority of caring whether they live, your grace, which is an authority you might claim too if you wanted it. It is lying about, unclaimed. No one is using it." But there was the smallest catch in her voice, for the truer answer, the answer about whose farm it truly was, sat just behind her teeth, and it cost her to swallow it again. She pressed her thumb to the cold cameo at her throat, hidden beneath her wet collar, and swallowed it, and said, "Only, drink your broth. You are no use to me frozen." Word of that night ran through the county faster than the flood had run through the cottages. How the new Duke's gray charity girl had saved the home farm in the dark, while the fine ladies slept, and named every tenant, and pulled old Hob from the water with her own hands. It did not make her loved by Mrs. Sefton, who heard it with a face like curdled milk, but it made her something more dangerous to Mrs. Sefton than loved. It made her respected, and a respected rival is far harder to ruin than a despised one, as Mrs. Sefton was shortly to learn. He found her, a few days after the flood, on a black December afternoon, standing alone in the long gallery before the portraits of his ancestors, looking up at the painted face of the old Duke, his father, with an expression Adrian could not read at all. "You look at him as if you knew him," Adrian said. "I never met him," Honoria said, which was true, and not the whole truth, and she did not turn from the portrait. "But I have lived a long time in his house. You learn a man from his house, I think, from what he kept and what he hid, from which doors lock." She tilted her head. "He has your jaw, or you have his. I have been told I have his temper, and his pride, and his way of ruining what he loves, rather than risk being seen to love it." Adrian surprised himself with the bitterness of it. "I have been told I am very like him." Honoria turned then, and looked at the living Duke instead of the painted one, and there was something almost like pity in her face. Pity, and a strange, reluctant tenderness she did not want, and could not entirely refuse. "Then I would unlearn it, your grace, while there is still time to unlearn it," she said quietly. His pride cost him a great deal. I should know better than most what it cost. And she went away down the gallery before he could ask her what she meant, her gray skirts whispering on the cold marble, leaving him alone with his father's painted eyes. That was the winter the Duke began to fall, though he would have died before naming it so, and it was the winter Mrs. Sefton began, in earnest, to make war. For Mrs. Sefton was not a fool, whatever Honoria's contempt for her. She had watched the Duke's eyes follow the gray girl at dinner. She had heard that he went below stairs at night. She had no intention of losing a dukedom to a charity ward, postponed wedding or no. And so she set about the work she did best, which was the slow public ruin of another woman. It began with small cruelties. Honoria's one good gown, the dark blue she kept for Sundays, went missing from her room, and was found a week later cut into rags in the laundry, and no one could say how. Her place below the salt grew lower still. The wooden trencher became a wooden bowl, the sort the dogs were fed from, and when Honoria set it aside and ate from a plain dish she fetched herself from the kitchen, Mrs. Sefton remarked at table on the boldness of servants who chose their own crockery these days. A rumor began to move through the county, gentle, deniable, deadly, that the Duke kept a kept woman below stairs, a sly gray creature who had got her claws into him, and that the postponed wedding was her doing. Honoria bore it as she bore everything, with a straight back and a closed face, and her own quiet accounting, in which every cruelty was entered and dated, and would one day be paid. But it cost her. She was not made of stone, whatever the house believed. On the worst nights, she took out the Japan box and traced the red seal, and reminded herself that the ground these people walked on was hers, and that the day was coming, and that a person who could wait was stronger than a person who could only strike. The cruelest of the small cruelties came at the Christmas ball. The Duke held it, because the old Duke had always held it, and the county expected it, and a house in mourning may grieve, but a dukedom must keep its forms. The great hall was cleared, and the 100 candles lit, and the county came in its silks and its diamonds. And Mrs. Sefton, in the late Duchess's pearls, stood at the Duke's side near the head of the room, as though the postponed wedding had already happened. Honoria was not asked. She had not expected to be. She kept to the gallery above, watching the dancing through the balustrade, as she had watched 100 things in this house from above and to the side. And it might have ended there. A girl in gray watching a ball she was not part of, had not Mrs. Sefton, flushed with wine and triumph and the certainty of her own victory, decided to be generous. "Bring the connection down," she said to a footman loudly, so that those near her heard. "It is Christmas. Even the charity should see how the gentry dance. Find her a partner among the grooms. I am sure she will be at home with them." So they brought Honoria down, and there was a space cleared, and the laughter starting, and a red-faced groom pushed forward as a jest to dance with the gray girl before the whole county. And it was the cruelest thing yet, more public and more deliberate than the salt or the wooden bowl, designed to make her run from the room in tears and end forever any fancy the Duke had taken to her. Honoria did not run. She stood in the cleared space in her gray gown, with the whole bright county looking on, and she lifted her chin, and she did the one thing no one expected. She turned to the red-faced groom, a decent lad, mortified, not the author of his own part in this, and she curtsied to him, deeply and with perfect grace, as one curtsies to an equal, and she said, clearly enough for the room to hear, "I thank you, but I do not dance tonight, not because I am ashamed of you. You are an honest man, which is more than I can say for the lady who set you here, but because I am keeping my dancing for a particular occasion that has not yet come." And then she turned slowly and looked directly at Mrs. Sefton across the cleared floor, and added, into the dead silence, "I should not wear another woman's pearls so confidently, madam. Pearls remember whose neck they were made for. So, in the end, do houses." And she walked out of the cleared space and up the great staircase, unhurried, her back straight, and the silence held until she was gone. And then it broke, not into laughter at her, but into a low, scandalized murmur that ran the length of the hall, and Mrs. Sefton stood in the late Duchess's pearls, with her face gone white and ugly, knowing that somehow, impossibly, she had lost the round. The Duke had seen it all. He had been too far across the room to stop it, and by the time he understood what was being done, it was already being undone by the girl in gray herself, with nothing but her chin and 12 sentences. And as she climbed the stairs away from him, he felt the snag in his chest pull tight and turn, finally, into something he could no longer pretend was curiosity. He went up after her. He found her in the cold, long gallery, standing very still before his father's portrait again, her hands pressed flat against her own ribs, as though holding something in. "Miss Vane." He did not know what he meant to say. What they did down there, what she did, I did not sanction it. I would not have. I know you would not. She did not turn. Her voice was steady, but only just. "You are not cruel, Your Grace. That is your trouble. You are not cruel and you are not kind. You are merely absent, and you let the cruel act in the space where you are not. Your father was the same. It is a very ducal sort of failing. You think because your own hands are clean, that you are clean. Now she did turn, and there were no tears, but her eyes were too bright, and her composure was a thing held together by main force. Do you know what is the cruelest thing about this house? Not the salt, not the bowl, not that woman and her borrowed pearls. The cruelest thing is that I could end it. I could end all of it with 3 sentences and a tin box. And I do not, because if I end it too soon, I lose it. And I have lost a very great deal already, and I will not lose this too. So I stand below your salt, and I curtsy to your grooms, and I wait. Have you any notion what it costs to be able to end a thing, and to choose to wait? What thing? Adrian said, very low. What is in the tin box, Miss Vane? And for one moment, one candlelit moment in the cold gallery with his father watching from the wall, she almost told him. He saw it in her face, the words gathering. He took a step toward her, and then she mastered it, and stepped back, and the door of her face closed. "Good night, your grace," she said. "Mend your house before you ask after my box. You have until Lady Day, I am told. After that, neither of us may have a house to quarrel in." She left him there, and the music came up faintly from below, and Adrian Ravensmere stood before his father's portrait, and understood 2 things. He had not let himself understand before: that he was in love with a girl who ate below his salt, and that she knew something about his ruined house that he did not. Something kept in a tin box, behind a closed face, waited on for some particular occasion that had not yet come. He did not sleep. He had not slept properly in weeks. But that night, for the first time, what kept him awake was not the bank. The new year came in hard and white. Snow lay on the deer park, and the rents could not be collected, and Mr. Hale wrote from London twice a week, with worse and worse news. And the banksman came down in January to walk the home farm and the house ground with a surveyor, measuring what they meant to take. Lady Day, the 25th of March, the day the great debt fell due, moved closer like a tide. And it was in that hard white January that the threads of the old secret began, at last, to pull loose, because Mr. Barlow grew greedy, and greed is careless. Barlow had kept his secret well for years. He had the original settlement and the original deed, lifted from the old Duke's desk after the death, and hidden in his own strong box in the market town. He had the knowledge of the false leaf in the parish register, and he had Honoria, kept ignorant and dependent at Ravensmere. A living asset he meant to cash one day on his own terms. His plan had always been patient. Wait until the title to the house ground became valuable enough, until someone needed it badly enough, and then sell what he knew to the highest bidder, the Duke or the bank, whoever would pay more to have the awkward truth made to disappear. But the bank's loan changed his arithmetic, and so did the postponed wedding, and so, though he did not know its true cause, did the rumor that the Duke had grown strangely fond of the Grey Ward. Barlow began to fear that the asset might slip from his hand. A married Honoria, a Honoria the Duke had taken a fancy to, a Honoria who might one day be looked at closely. That was a danger. Better, Barlow decided, to act now, to approach the bank quietly, sell them the knowledge that the house grounds title was bad, let them foreclose and seize it cheap, and take his cut from the bank, and then remove Honoria somewhere quiet and final, the workhouse or worse, before she could ever become an inconvenience. What Barlow did not know was that Honoria was no longer the ignorant girl he had placed at Ravensmere 4 years before. She had found him out slowly, over those 4 years, with the patience that was her only weapon. She had read the few papers Mrs. Vane left. She had noticed how the steward would not meet her eyes, how Barlow flinched when she spoke of her mother, how no one would tell her where her mother was buried. She had gone, on her one free day each quarter, to the parish church, and charmed the half-blind old sexton, and read the registers, and found the false leaf, clumsily pasted, and beneath it, just visible, the ghost of an older entry. She had pieced it together the way she did everything, quietly, completely, and to herself. She had not found the original settlement indeed. Those were in Barlow's strongbox in the town, and she did not yet know where. But she had found enough to know who she was, and she had copied the register entry, and waited, and watched Barlow, and understood that the man was a coward and a thief, and would one day overreach. In the last week of January, he did. He came to Ravensmere in his gig through the snow, and he met privately with the banksman in the village inn, and Honoria, who had her own friends below stairs. The under-housemaid, whose sister served at the inn, knew of the meeting within the hour. She did not know yet exactly what was said, but she knew that her guardian and the banksman had sat together over brandy with their heads close, and that was enough to tell her that the tide had turned, and the particular occasion she had waited for was, at last, beginning to come. That night she did not trace the seal and say, "Not yet." She took the japanned box out from under the board, and she sat on her cold cot, and she said very quietly, "Now, we begin." The first thing she did was the thing no one would have expected of a girl who ate below the salt. She wrote to a solicitor. Not Mr. Hale. Hale was the Duke's man, and bound to the Duke's interest, and she did not yet know whether the Duke's interest and her own would run together or against. She wrote instead to her grandfather's old firm, Aldous having been her mother's name, and her mother's father an attorney. The firm still existed in the county town, Pelham and Pelham, grown gray and small, but honest. She wrote in her own neat hand, on paper she bought with her own few shillings, and she enclosed her copy of the register entry, and she asked one question: Does the firm hold, or know the whereabouts of, the marriage settlement of Margaret Aldous, made on her marriage in the year of our Lord, and the deed to the home farm and house ground at Ravensmere settled thereby? The answer, when it came 10 days later, changed the shape of the world. Old Mr. Pelham himself wrote back, for he remembered Margaret Aldous had been a young clerk in the office when her father drew the settlement, had thought of it more than once over the years, with unease. The firm did not hold the original. The old attorney had given it into the keeping of the family. But, and here Honoria read the line 3 times by her tallow candle, the firm held the attorney's draft and his attested office copy, kept in the strong room these 24 years, complete with the schedule of the lands, the trust to Margaret and the heirs of her body, and the signatures of the witnesses. An office copy, properly attested, was evidence a court would hear. The original in Barlow's strongbox was the better proof, but it was no longer the only proof, and old Mr. Pelham wrote one thing more. If you are who your letter and your hand and your knowledge of these matters suggest you are, then you are no Vane, madam, but the only lawful child of the late Duke of Ravensmere by his first and secret marriage. And the home farm and the very ground his great house stands upon are yours, and have been yours since the hour of your mother's death, and no debt your father pledged them against can stand, for they were never his to pledge. Come to me, come quietly, and come soon, and bring your copy of the register, and let us see justice done." Honoria read the letter through, and then she pressed her thumb hard against the cold cameo at her throat, her mother's cameo, Margaret Aldis's, and held it there a long while, as though to be sure the woman in the little carved profile knew. Then she folded the letter, and then, for the first time in more years than she could count, she put her face in her soft hands and wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable relief of being, at last, on the verge of being known. This is the midpoint of our story, and the moment the ground beneath the whole house shifted. Though only Honoria, weeping by her tallow candle with an attorney's letter in her lap, yet knew it. She had crossed from a girl who suspected what she was to a woman who could prove it. The deed was real. The settlement was real. The house ground was hers. In law, against the Duke and the bank and Barlow, and all the world. The only questions left were how and when, and at what cost, and whether, when the Candlelit truth finally stood up in that great hall and overturned every seat, the proud Duke who had seated her below his salt would prove worthy of the woman she had been all along. She dried her face. She did not let herself weep twice. She took up her pen again, and by the same tallow candle, she began to plan the unmaking of every cruelty she had entered in her long, quiet account. Not with rage, for rage was wasteful, but with the cold, clear precision of a woman reading a column of figures. She has finally been given leave to settle. What followed, through February and the first weeks of March, was a quiet war fought in letters and ledgers and locked rooms, beneath the notice of the proud people above the salt. Honoria went twice to the county town on her quarter days, and once, daringly, on a borrowed half-day she did not ask leave for. She sat in old Mr. Pelham's dim office, with its smell of dust and sealing wax, and she learned the whole of her own history from the man who had been a clerk when it began. She learned the date of her mother's secret marriage and the name of the frightened curate who performed it, dead now these 20 years, but his hand in the register still. She learned the names of the 2 grooms who had witnessed it. One dead, one, astonishingly, still living. A very old man in an almshouse not 6 miles off, who, when Pelham's clerk was sent to him, remembered the wet morning and the young Duke's pale face and signed a sworn statement with a shaking hand. She learned that the law was on her side so completely that Pelham grew almost gleeful. The settlement was watertight. The trust was clear. The home farm and house ground had passed to her at her mother's death, and the old Duke had committed something near to fraud in pledging them. And the bank, however innocent, could take nothing it had no good title to. You hold the deed in effect, madam, whether the physical parchment sits in your hand or in the strongbox of the rogue Barlow. Old Mr. Pelham told her, cleaning his own spectacles with an unsteady hand, for he was old and moved by the strangeness of it. The land is yours. The house your half-brother calls his sits upon your ground. He cannot pay his debt. The bank means to seize the ground to satisfy it, and neither of them can lawfully do the one or the other, because the ground was never the old Duke's to mortgage. When this is known, the bank's loan against the house ground falls. The Duke is saved from the bank, and ruined before you, for he holds his great house only by your leave. You will be, in the most literal sense, his landlord. The proud house of Ravensmere will stand or fall at the word of the girl they seat below the salt. He set his spectacles back on his nose. What do you mean to do with such a power, madam? For it is a very great one, and great powers have a way of changing the hand that holds them. Honoria was quiet a moment. Outside the dusty window, the market town went about its small business in the cold. I mean to be just, she said at last, which is not the same as being kind, and not the same as being cruel. The cruel will be exposed, because justice exposes them. The kind will be rewarded, because justice rewards them. And the Duke, she paused. The Duke will be given a chance to be better than his father. One chance. If he takes it, he keeps his house. If he does not, I shall be a very fair landlord to whoever takes it from him. She rose and drew on her worn gloves. Draw up everything, Mr. Pelham. The proofs, the office copy, the old groom's statement, the surveyor's plan of exactly which ground is mine. I want it so complete that no one in that hall can pretend, for even one breath, that it is not true. And tell no one. The thing must land all at once, or it does not land at all. So Pelham drew it all up, and Honoria carried her secret back to Ravensmere, and went on trimming the candles and keeping the books and eating below the salt. But now she ate below the salt, the way a sovereign sits incognito at a country inn, and the people above the salt, who could not have said why, grew uneasy in her presence without knowing the ground had already shifted beneath their gilded chairs. 2 things, meanwhile, were happening above the salt that Honoria turned to her purpose. The first was that Barlow's plot with the bank advanced. The bank's man, persuaded by Barlow that the house ground's title was bad and could be had cheap, pressed the foreclosure forward and set the seizure for the day after Lady Day. Barlow, scenting his profit, grew bolder. He came openly to Ravensmere now, dined above the salt at Lady Pruitt's invitation, and looked at Honoria across the silver with the smug ownership of a man admiring an asset he is about to sell. He did not know she had been to Pelham. He thought her still the kept ignorant girl. He was, though he did not feel it, standing directly over the spot where the powder was laid. The second was that the Duke, in his quiet desperation and his quieter love, did a thing that surprised even himself. In the second week of March, with 10 days to Lady Day and ruin closing in, he came to the still room at midnight, where he knew he would find her, and he asked Honoria to marry him. It was not a romantic proposal. He was too proud and too miserable for romance, and she was too watchful. He stood by the cold dresser with the account books between them, and he said plainly, "I am going to lose this house, Miss Vane. The bank will have it at Lady Day, and there is nothing Hale or I can do. I have lain awake a great many nights, and I find that the loss of the house frightens me less than I expected. And one other loss frightens me a great deal more. I have no fortune to offer you. I have a title the bank cannot take, and a house it can, and a name my father dishonored, and a temper you have rightly warned me against. It is the worst offer a duke has ever made, but I find I would rather be ruined beside you than saved without you, and I have never in my life said anything I meant more. Marry me, Honoria. Not the connection of the house, not the girl below the salt. You, whoever you truly are, with your tin box and your closed face, and your terrible patience. Marry me before I have nothing at all to ask you with." It was, Honoria thought afterward, the cruelest moment of her whole long ordeal, far crueler than the salt or the bowl or the ball, because for the first time the cruelty came from inside her own breast. For he meant it. She could see that he meant it, this proud man humbling himself in a still room at midnight, offering her a ruined house and a dishonored name, with his whole bruised heart in his eyes. And she loved him. She had stopped being able to deny it somewhere in the cold gallery before his father's portrait, and every instinct she had cried out to say yes, to step into the warmth of being chosen, to lay down at last the terrible weight of her patience. And she could not yet, because if she said yes now, in his ignorance, she would never know whether he had chosen her or her land, and worse, he would never know it himself, and because the truth, once she let it out, would land far harder and far more justly if it landed in its own time, in that great hall, before the very people who had laughed, and not whispered between two lovers in a midnight still-room where no one could be set right. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than enduring, because endurance she was practiced in, and this she was not. She refused him. "No, your grace," she said, and her voice did not break, though something in her chest did. "Not now. Do not ask me how I know, but I tell you that you must not lose this house, and that you will not lose it, and that on the day after Lady Day, a great many things will be made plain that are hidden now. Wait until then. Wait, as I have waited. And when everything is known, everything, the worst of it, and the strangest of it, if you can stand in your great hall before the whole county and ask me again, knowing all that you do not know tonight, then ask me again. But not now, not in the dark, not while you are afraid. I will not be a thing a frightened man clutches at in the night." She pressed her own thumb hard against the small cold cameo at her throat. Her mother's cameo, the one thing of Margaret Aldous' that had come down to her, which she wore always beneath her collar and pressed when she needed to hold herself together. And she said, more gently, "Trust me until then. I am asking you to trust a girl who eats below your salt. I know how much I am asking. Ask me again in the hall, and you shall have your answer. I swear it on the only thing I have, which is my mother's name. though you do not yet know what that name is." And she gathered the books and left him there, in the still room, for the third time, with a candle and a closed door, and a question he could not answer. And this time, he did not feel only the snag of curiosity, or even the ache of love, but the first cold stir of understanding that the girl below his salt held the fate of his whole house in her soft and patient hands, and had held it, perhaps, all along. The days to Lady Day ran out like sand. Mrs. Sefton, sensing that her dukedom was slipping with the house, made her last and worst throw. If she could not be Duchess of a great estate, she would at least not be cast off, and she calculated shrewdly enough that if she could force the Duke's hand publicly, bind him to her before the county with a thing he could not in honor undo, she might yet salvage a marriage from the wreck. And she calculated, too, that the way to do it was to destroy, finally and completely, the gray rival she still did not understand, but had come to hate. She chose the occasion with care. The old Duke's memorial, the first anniversary of his death, fell 3 days before Lady Day, and the family held a solemn dinner and a service in the estate chapel, the whole county invited, mourning worn, the great hall hung again with black crape, as it had been a year before. It was the most public and most sacred gathering of the Ravensmere year, and it was there, before the bishop and the baronets and the whole assembled county, in the black-draped hall over the memorial dinner, that Mrs. Sefton sprang her trap. She rose, glass in hand, the late Duchess's pearls at her white throat, and she proposed, sweetly, tremblingly, as though overcome, a toast to the Duke, and to the future of the great house, and to the union that all here have long expected, which only grief and delicacy have delayed. She turned to Adrian with her glass raised, and her eyes shining, and the whole county watching, and she said, "Dearest Adrian, say the word here, before your father's memory and all our friends, and let us end the doubt that has shadowed this house. Make me your Duchess." It was masterly. To refuse her now, publicly, at his father's memorial, before the bishop, would be an insult so cruel and so dishonorable that the county would never forgive it. A gentleman, a duke, could not do it. She had him, she thought, exactly where she wanted him. And down below the salt, the gray girl would have to sit and watch her triumph. The hall held its breath. Adrian stood, white-faced, the trap closed around him, searching for the honorable words that did not exist, and from below the salt, into the terrible silence, Honoria Vane stood up. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. She stood in her gray gown below the silver salt cellar, and she set down the wooden bowl they still gave her. And she said, clearly enough, to reach the farthest black-draped corner of the hall, "Before the Duke answers, I think the company should hear something. It concerns this house, and whose it is, and it cannot wait for a more convenient day, for the bank means to seize the ground beneath us in 3 days' time, and every soul in this hall ought to know, before any toasts are drunk, that they cannot." "Sit down," hissed Lady Pruitt. "Sit down, you impertinent." "I will not sit down," Honoria said, and she pressed her thumb once against the cameo at her throat, the way she always did before the hardest words, and there was something in the quiet of it that silenced even Lady Pruitt. "I have sat down in this hall for 4 years. I have sat below the salt and eaten from a wooden bowl, and been called the connection of the house, and the charity, and worse. I have trimmed your candles, and kept your books, and held my tongue. I am done with sitting down." She turned, slowly, to the bishop. "My lord bishop, you are a man sworn to truth, and I will ask you to be the judge of what I now lay before this company. May I send for the documents I have lodged this week with Mr. Pelham of Pelham and Pelham, attorneys of the county town, and with Mr. Hale, his Grace's own solicitor, whom I wrote to 3 days ago, and who arrived this afternoon and is, I believe, standing even now at the back of this hall, every head turned, and there at the back, by the great doors, stood thin, precise Mr. Hale, cleaning his spectacles with his gray silk handkerchief, his black case in his hand. And beside him, white-haired and trembling with the gravity of the hour, stood old Mr. Pelham himself, who had come the long, cold road from the county town because he would not for the world have missed seeing justice done to Margaret Aldous' daughter. "They are here, Miss Vane," said Mr. Hale, into the ringing silence, settling his spectacles upon his nose. "We are both of us here. And I must tell this company that having seen what Mr. Pelham brought to me this afternoon, and having checked it against the records in my own keeping, and against the parish register this very evening, I am satisfied, wholly satisfied, as a solicitor of 29 years' standing, that every word Miss Vane is about to speak is true. And so, at last, in the black-draped hall on the anniversary of her father's death, before the bishop and the baronets and the whole assembled county, and the proud duke who had forgotten her name, Honoria Vane told them who she was. She told it plainly, as Pelham had taught her, without heat and without tears, because the facts were thunder enough and needed no help from her. She told them of the secret marriage in the small stone church 24 years before. And Mr. Pelham, when she looked to him, held up the attested office copy of the marriage settlement and the sworn statement of the old groom from the almshouse, who had witnessed the wedding with his own eyes, and signed his shaking name to the proof. She told them of the daughter hidden under the Vane name, paid for and ignored, and she drew from beneath her collar the small cameo at her throat, and told them it had been her mother's, Margaret Aldous', the only thing of her that survived. She told them of the marriage settlement that gave the home farm and the very ground the great house stood upon to Margaret and the heirs of her body, to her, Honoria, since the hour of her mother's death, and never to the old duke, and never to the title, so that the old duke had pledged to the bank a thing that was not his, and the bank could take nothing, and the house was safe from the bank, and standing every flagstone of it upon her ground. "So you see, my lord bishop," she said, turning at last to the white-faced duke, who had sat down somewhere in the telling because his legs would no longer hold him, "His Grace cannot lose this house to the bank, for the bank has no good title to the ground and never had. But neither, I am sorry to say, does His Grace own the ground his house stands upon. I do. I have in law, since I was an infant in arms. I am the late Duke's only lawful child. The gray girl you have seated below your salt these 4 years is your landlord, gentlemen. And from this hour, this house stands by my leave, or it does not stand at all." The hall erupted. There is no other word for it. The county, which had come to drink toasts over a memorial dinner, found itself instead at the unmaking of a world, and it could not contain itself. Some cried out that it was a fraud, a mad servant's fancy, until Mr. Hale and old Mr. Pelham, gravely and together, held up the proofs and named the law, and the cries died. Lady Pruitt had gone the color of ash. The bishop rose, deeply moved, and said in his great pulpit voice that he had heard the proofs and seen the documents, and that the company would conduct itself with the dignity the occasion demanded, and that Miss Vane, the Lady Honoria, he corrected himself, and the correction ran round the hall like fire, should be heard to the end. But it was Mrs. Sefton who undid herself completely, for Mrs. Sefton, in her fury and her terror, lost the cold cunning that had served her, and she shrieked across the hall the thing she should never have said. "She is lying. Barlow, Barlow, you told me the girl was nobody, that you held the only proof and it would never come out. You swore the title was bad, and the bank would have it, and we should—" And she stopped, white, her hand at the borrowed pearls, as the whole hall turned to stare at her, and at the man she had named, who sat frozen above the salt with his brandy halfway to his lips. It was the confession that hanged them both. In her panic, Mrs. Sefton had named Barlow's plot aloud, the conspiracy with the bank, the suppression of the proofs, the plan to have the ground seized cheap and Honoria removed, and named her own part in it, before the bishop and the county and the duke. Mr. Hale, very quietly, set down his spectacles and said that this was a serious matter, and that Mr. Barlow had, he believed, in his strong box in the town, the very original documents he had sworn did not exist, the suppression of which from the late Duke's estate was a grave crime, and that he thought it best that nobody leave the hall until certain magistrates had been sent for. Barlow bolted for the doors. The Duke's footmen, led by a grim young footman named Daniel Good, who had carried Honoria's wooden bowl too many times and was glad past speaking to do this instead, were there before him, and in the midst of the uproar, the white-faced Duke rose from his chair and crossed the whole length of the great hall, past the silver salt cellar, down to the plain end of the table, where the gray girl stood beside her abandoned wooden bowl, and stopped before her, and the hall fell silent again, to watch. "You knew," he said, not in anger, in wonder. "All this time, that night in the still room, when I asked you to marry me and you refused me, you knew. You held the house in your hand, and you let me believe I would lose it. You let me make you the worst offer a duke ever made, and you said no because—" His voice failed him, and he tried again. "Because you would not be a thing a frightened man clutched at in the night. You said I must ask you again in the hall, when everything was known. You said it on your mother's name, though I did not know what her name was." He looked at the cameo at her throat, and at her steady gray eyes, and the proud, austere mask of his face broke at last, wholly, into something open and unguarded and humbled. It was Margaret. Your mother's name was Margaret, and mine is the name of the family that wronged her. And you, Honoria, Lady Honoria, I do not deserve to ask, but you told me to ask you again in the hall, when everything was known. Everything is known now. So I am asking, knowing that you are my landlord, and I am your debtor, knowing that you owe me nothing, and I owe you everything, knowing that I have been to you exactly the absent, careless, prideful man you warned me I was, I am asking, will you have me? Not the house, not the title, me, chastened and ashamed, and yours. And the whole county held its breath to hear what the girl below the salt would say to the Duke above it, now that every seat in the hall had been overturned. Honoria looked at him, while a log settled in the great fireplace, and not one soul in the hall dared breathe. She did not enjoy his humbling, though she had earned the right to. She looked at the man, not the Duke. The man who had come below stairs at midnight to talk because she was the only mind in the house worth speaking to. The man who had offered her a ruined house with his whole bruised heart. The man who was, even now, in front of the whole county, choosing to make himself low so that she might be raised. And she found that the cold, clear account she had kept so long, every cruelty entered and dated and waiting to be settled, had only ever had his name in the credit column, never the debit. He had been absent. He had never been cruel. A difference lay between those two things, and she had always known it, and it was the difference on which everything now turned. But she did not say yes. Not yet, because she had sworn to herself, long ago, that whatever else happened, she would first choose herself, would stand once, fully, on her own ground, before she chose to share it. And she would not surrender that for any man's bended knee, however dearly bought. "I will give you my answer," she said, "but first I will give this company 3 things, so that no one here may ever say the Lady Honoria was raised up by a duke's pity. I was not raised up by anyone. I raised myself in the dark, with patience, while you all sat above the salt and never saw me." She turned to the hall. First, Mr. Barlow and Mrs. Sefton will answer to the magistrates for what they have done, and I will press it to the full, not for revenge, but because the law that protects me must protect the next girl whom no one believes. Second, Lady Pruitt. The gray, sharp woman flinched. You pressed your nails into my wrist in the passage and told me a workhouse waited on me at your word. There is no workhouse for me now, and there is no longer any place at Ravensmere for you. You will be gone by Lady Day. I will give you a small annuity, because I am just, and not 1 penny more, because I am not a fool. Third, she turned back to the Duke, and for the first time in 4 years, in front of the whole county, in the black-draped hall, the gray girl below, the salt smiled. Third, His Grace has asked me a question, in this hall, where I told him to ask it, knowing everything there is to know, and so I will answer it. But I will answer it standing on my own ground, in my own house, as Margaret Aldis's daughter, and no man's charity. Adrian! She had never used his name before. It fell into the silence, like a stone into a still pool. You were absent, and careless, and proud, and you forgot my name, and you seated me below your salt. And then, when you had nothing left to gain by it, and a great deal to lose, you came down to where I was, and you saw me, and you chose me, when you believed it would ruin you. A man's worth is not in how he treats those above his salt. It is in how he treats those below it, when he thinks no one of consequence is watching. You failed that test for 3 years. And then, in a midnight still room, with everything to lose, you passed it. She held out her soft hand to him, the hand whose softness had betrayed her breeding all along, across the place where the salt no longer divided them. Yes, I will have you, but you will spend the rest of your life remembering that I chose you from above, not from below, and that I keep the deed in the box against the day you forget it. And the Duke of Ravensmere took the hand of the girl he had seated below his salt and bowed his proud head over it. And the great hall that had laughed at her broke at last not into scandal, but into something it had not done in living memory at a Ravensmere gathering. It broke into applause, led, of all people, by the red-faced groom from the Christmas ball, who stood at the back by Daniel Good and clapped until his hands were sore. Because he had known, he said to anyone who would listen for years afterward, he had known she was keeping her dancing for a particular occasion. The magistrates came within the hour, 2 of them, roused from their beds, for a fraud upon a bank, and the suppression of a duke's settlement was no small county matter. And they did the thing that ended all argument forever. They sent under guard to Barlow's lodging in the market town, with Barlow himself brought along in irons to give up the key, and they fetched his strong-box back to Ravensmere and set it upon the very table in the great hall, below the silver salt-cellar, where Honoria had eaten from a wooden bowl 4 years running, and there, before the bishop and the magistrates, and Mr. Hale, and old Mr. Pelham, and the Duke, and the Lady Honoria, and as many of the county as had not yet gone home, they made Barlow open it, with his own shaking hands. It was a plain iron box, banded and double-locked, and the room was so silent, as he turned the key, that the click of the lock was heard at the far wall. He lifted the lid, and there inside, under a tray of his own mean papers and a roll of guineas that proved how he had meant to be paid, lay a folded parchment gone amber with 24 years, the original marriage settlement of Margaret Aldis, with the schedule of the lands and the trust to the heirs of her body, and beneath it the original deed to the home farm and the house ground, sealed with the old Duke's own great red wax, the seal whole and unbroken, and folded with them, the suppressed leaf torn long ago from the parish register, the true entry of the secret marriage in the frightened curate's hand. Mr. Hale lifted them out one by one, and held each up to the candlelight, and named it aloud, so that no soul in that hall could ever after pretend not to have seen. The settlement, he said, and the room breathed. The deed, the seal is the late Duke's. I have witnessed his seal 100 times. It is genuine." He held the brittle register leaf with the care of a man handling a relic. "And the truth that this man tore out of God's own book and locked in a thief's box for 24 years, that a girl might be kept from her name. He set them down on the white cloth in the center of the table, beside the salt cellar. There is no longer any question in this matter. There is only justice, and what we do with it." Barlow, irons on his wrists, made one last throw. He turned to Honoria and whined that he had only ever meant to keep her safe, that the world was hard on a girl with no protector, that he had done it for her good. And Honoria looked at the man who had stolen 4 years of her name and meant to steal the rest. And she did not strike him, and she did not weep, and she did not even raise her voice. She only said quite quietly, "You kept the proof of who I was in a locked box, Mr. Barlow, and told me I was nobody. That is not protection. That is the precise shape of every cruelty ever done in this house. To lock the truth away and let the person it belongs to go hungry beside it. I have eaten beside that box, in a manner of speaking, for 4 years. I find I have no appetite left for your excuses." And she turned her back on him, which the county agreed afterward was a worse sentence than any the assizes could pass. Barlow was tried at the spring assizes for the suppression of a will and a fraud upon the bank, and was transported. Mrs. Sefton, who had conspired with him, was not charged, for her crime was harder to name in law, but she was finished in the county more completely than any court could have finished her. She left for Bath within the month, and gave back the late Duchess's pearls before she went, because the Lady Honoria sent Daniel Good to ask for them, courteously, and once. Lady Pruitt took her small annuity and her sharp tongue to a cousin in Harrogate, and was not missed. The bank, faced with proof that its loan against the house ground had been secured on land the old Duke never owned, withdrew its claim to the ground, rather than face the scandal and the certain loss in court, and the other debts, the lesser ones against the timber and the deer park. The Lady Honoria settled herself, in time, from the rents of her own land, for she was a landlord now in deed as well as in law, and she ran the home farm and the house ground, as she ran everything, with a clear eye, and a settled account, and a fairness her tenants spoke of for a generation. The proud house of Ravensmere did not fall. It stood, every flagstone of it, upon her ground. And now, at last, openly so. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church on the Ravensmere lands where her mother had been married in secret 24 years before. But Honoria's wedding was not secret. She would have no more secrets in that family. Secrecy had been the old Duke's crime, and she had paid for it her whole life, and she would not pass it on. The whole county came, openly, in daylight, and the bishop himself married them, and the register that recorded it was entered in a clear hand on a clean leaf, with no false page pasted over it, where anyone might read it for 100 years. She wore, not gray, but a gown of deep candle cream silk, and at her throat the small cameo that had been her mother's. And when the curate asked her name to enter it in the book, she gave it whole and unhidden for the first time in her life. Honoria Vane, lawful daughter of the late Duke, soon the Duchess of Ravensmere, though she always said afterward that of all her names she was proudest of the plain middle one, Aldous, her mother's name, the name on which she had sworn and kept her oath. The life she built after is the part the reference channels too often leave untold, and so I will tell it, for it is the best part, and she earned every hour of it. She did not, as some expected, become a hard mistress drunk on her overturned fortune. She had spent too long below the salt to grow cruel above it. She had seen exactly what cruelty cost, and she had no wish to pay it from the other side of the table. The first thing she did with her own money, not the Duke's, for the Duke had little, but hers, from the rents of her own land, was to rebuild the 3 home farm cottages the flood had ruined, higher up the slope and out of the brook's reach, with good slate roofs and dry hearths. and she had them done before the wedding, so that the hobs and the tranters were warm and dry by the first frost. Old Mr. Hob, whom she had pulled from the black water, lived to see his grandson take a clean, dry cottage on the ground his fathers had farmed, and he told the boy, every quarter day until he died, the story of the night the Lady Honoria came into the flood for him and told him she had plans for the farm. She had had plans. She kept them. That was the whole of her. There came a first rent day under the new mistress, the Michaelmas after the wedding, and the tenants came up to the great hall to pay, half fearing what manner of landlord a wronged woman raised so suddenly might prove. They found long tables set in the hall, and the salt set in the center of every one of them, and a hot dinner laid for every tenant who came, the rents taken in the morning by the Lady Honoria herself, with her own neat ledger, and not 1 farthing more than was owed, and abatements written off for the 2 widows and the man whose ewes had died of the rot. One old tenant, a man named Tranter, whose baby she had carried out of the flood, stood twisting his hat at her ledger table that first rent day, and said, "Begging your pardon, my lady, but they're saying below the hill you sat 4 years at the bottom of his grace's table and never once let on whose ground we all stood on. Is it true?" "It is true," Honoria said, entering his payment in her clear hand, without looking up. "Then why'd you wait, my lady? 4 years. You could have spoke any day." She set down her pen then, and looked at him, and gave him the only answer she had ever found. That was the whole of it. "Because a thing said too soon is only noise, Mr. Tranter, and a thing said at the right hour is justice. I had only the one chance to be believed. I spent it carefully." She took up the pen again. "Your roof, the slates on the north side. I saw them slipping when I rode by Tuesday. Send your boy up to the house. I'll have the slater to you before the rains." She knew every holding. She knew every name. She had, after all, kept the books of that estate by candlelight for years, while the great slept. There was not a corner of it she did not understand better than the Duke did, and she ran it openly now, with the same clear eye and settled account she had always had, and her tenants spoke of her fairness for a generation, exactly as old Mr. Pelham had once hoped they might, and the Duke earned her, daily, as she had told him he must, not with one grand apology, which she had no use for, but with 10,000 small choosings. He learned the tenants' names, every one, and would not be excused the learning. He went down himself in foul weather to see a sick cottager, because his wife had taught him that the authority of caring was lying about unclaimed, and he had decided to claim it. He gave over to her, without a murmur, the running of the home farm and the house ground that were hers by right, and asked her counsel on the rest, and took it more often than not, and was the better Duke for it. Once, early in the marriage, his old pride stirred, and he spoke sharply to her before a servant, in the manner of his father, and Honoria said nothing in the moment. But that night, she took down the Japan tin box from its high shelf and set it, without a word, on the table between them. She did not open it. She did not need to. He understood. "I keep the deed against the day you forget it." And he went gray, and he begged her pardon, and he never spoke so to her again. It was the only time the box was used as a weapon, and it was used gently, and once. After that, it sat on its shelf as what it truly was, not a threat, but a memory of who she had been, and who she had chosen not to become. They had children, in time, a daughter first, whom they named Margaret, openly, for the grandmother the family had once hidden, so that the name, long buried under a false leaf, was spoken aloud in that house every day, in a child's laughter, where it could never be hidden again. And Honoria, who had grown up not knowing her mother's grave, took the little Margaret each spring to the small stone church and showed her the clean, clear entry in the register, and said, "This was your grandmother. She owned the ground this house stands on, and they tried to make the world forget her. And they did not succeed, because I would not let them. Remember her name. A house remembers how it treated people. So does a family. See that ours remembers well." There was one more thing she did, on her first night as mistress of the house that stood upon her ground. And it is the thing the servants told longest, and the thing I will leave you with. She had the great chased salt cellar brought to her in the long gallery, where she stood once more before the old Duke's portrait. Her father's portrait, she could call it now. She looked up at the painted face that had hidden her all her life, the face with Adrian's jaw, and she did not curse it, for she had no curses left in her. She had spent her cruelty on justice, and found, when justice was done, that there was none left over for spite. She only looked at it a long while in the candlelight, and then she turned to Daniel Good, who had carried her wooden bowl so often, and now carried the silver, and she told him where to put the salt cellar from, that night forward. Not at the head of the table, above which the grate sat, not 2/3 down, where it had stood to mark her out and shame her. She had it set in the very center of the long table, dead center, equidistant from both ends, so that at the Lady Honoria's table ever after, there was no above the salt and no below it. There was only the table, and the people at it, and the light of the candles falling equally on all of them. A house remembers how it treated people, she said to Daniel Good, who never forgot it. Let this one remember that it learned better. And the Duke, coming into the gallery and finding her there before his father's portrait with the salt cellar, moved to the center and the candles burning low, understood the whole of his wife in that one small act, and loved her the more for it, and never once in all the long years of their marriage forgot her name again. She kept the japanned tin box. She kept the original deed and the original settlement in it, with the red seal and her mother's name, on a high shelf in her own writing room. And she did not need to take it out and trace the seal any longer. And she did not say soon to the dark any more, because soon had come. But she kept it. And once a year, on the anniversary of her mother's secret wedding, she took it down and opened it and read the old groom's shaking signature and her mother's name, and remembered the cold years below the salt and the patience that had brought her up from them, not so that she could nurse the old wound, but so that she would never become one of the people who had wronged her. The box was the proof of who she was. The salt cellar in the center of the table was the proof of who she had chosen to become. And so the candle burns low on the tale of the wife who sat below the salt at her own table, and held all the while the deed to her husband's estate, and waited, through the salt and the wooden bowl, the ruined gown, and the Christmas ball, the midnight proposal she had to refuse, and the long cold road to Lady Day, for the one particular occasion when she could stand on her own ground and be known. She did not strike when she could have. She did not crawl when they wished her to. She waited, and she chose herself first, and then she chose love freely, from above the salt and not below it. That is the whole of it. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.